not doing enough, it's not doing it fast enough, it's not doing it early enough, and it's not also teaching it in the right way. One of the things that, and I also didn't do it in the right way for a very, very long time, because are the most important in the design process. So there's 5 of them: explore, define, imagine, test, and then we live on the same planet, and nobody's gonna care about architecture and beauty and the beautiful spaces we create when we're in a 4 degrees Celsius world. Nobody is gonna care. Architecture will not matter at that point. Hey, yeah, thanks for inviting me. So my name is Sofie Pelsmakers. I'm originally from Belgium, and I'm trained as an architect. Actually, quite some time ago now, more than 20 years ago, or about 20 years ago, at East London University. So I'm a graduate, and then I also taught for 10 years at the university as well. But then I moved on to UCL to do my PhD. And then Brexit happened. So I then left from UCL in Sheffield to Denmark, and now I'm in Finland, where I'm professor in sustainable housing design. And so my expertise and what I've been dedicating the last 20 years to is basically sustainable architecture, and then particularly low energy, low carbon transformation, social housing, inclusive design, and all of those aspects. And I've also been very much focusing on, how do we also create this change in practice? So how do we bridge the information gap between research, academia and practice, but then also how can we teach it better to then create change in reality? And so I authored an environmental design pocketbook in 2012, and then it was edition 2 in 2015. And I'm working on the 3rd edition, but that's delayed because I've also then been working on other publications like the Designing for the Climate Emergency book that I was lead author of, that came out just in June, and that's specifically focusing on student guidance in architecture school. So I think that's in a nutshell my last 20 years. It's slightly scary. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, and so how did you start this passion for sustainability? When did you find out you want to pursue or give a bit more research about it?
It happened at UBL, actually. And we're talking now in 1999, when I joined UEL. I was accepted at UEL, so I did my bachelor's in Belgium, where I was born. And then I was accepted at UEL after I'd done a few years out. And I was asked to attend, I had to choose a theory option. And I was given a list, a printout, and which was history and theory, sustainable architecture, and environmental and energy studies, or planning, landscape design. And I just went to the first one, which was environment and energy, and I never left. So for me, it was a homecoming, understanding that if I was going to be an architect, that I had a bigger responsibility. And, for me, that was really a homecoming, knowing that that I could make a big difference. Particularly my undergrad, I wasn't even sure if I wanted to be an architect. We were very much educated in Belgium to design rich people's houses. I mean, not solely, but that's sort of, when I look back, why I didn't feel I fitted in very well. It was sort of like, on the whole, quite a different environment. And I, coming from a single parent family, grandparents who were smallhold farmers, working class family, not very rich, I didn't really feel I fitted in Belgium. And so, so coming to UEL was eye-opening, and particularly then also finding meaning through being able to create a better tomorrow was for me homecoming. And I never turned my back on anything since then. I mean, it's always been part of my studies, of everything that I've done, has always been sustainable architecture.
Okay. And I know as well that you published a book last year, Emergency Climate for Architects. And correct me if I'm wrong about the title, but I've got that book as well. It's really interesting. And we probably will touch a little bit more later about the book. But through your research and the knowledge that you have, so how would you describe the relationships between the climate change and the sustainable architecture?
Well, the book is called Designing for the Climate Emergency, a guide for architecture students, but it's okay because we were close enough. But yeah, I mean, firstly, of course, and these are so basically about the link between the two, the relationship between climate change and sustainable architecture is that we all know that architecture as part of the building industry is a big contributor to climate change. And then also, of course, a changing climate in turn as well. Mainly, of course, because in the production and in the use of the spaces and buildings we design, we use a lot of energy that's often achieved by burning fossil fuels, and then creates global heating and, through releasing CO2 that's irreversibly changing our planet. So that's the obvious kind of link. The other link is, of course, as well that when we design buildings and we don't design them very well, they lock in this unsustainable behavior of buildings, energy use, how they affect health and well-being for a very long time, because our buildings and master plans should last for decades or centuries as well. So we have a huge responsibility there. But so really sustainable architecture must both mitigate, so preventing climate change, but then also adapting to climate change. And the important thing is also, it's not just about that. And that's also what we try to cover in the book, Designing for the Climate Emergency, that this isn't solely about energy and CO2, but it's about health and well-being. It's about radical inclusivity. So democratic processes to include users and communities, but also nature and non-human beings into our proposals as well. So I think it's not just about the green transition, but about an inclusive and fair transition as well. And that's, I think, a link that's become really more and more clear for me in the last few years as well, that we have to reframe how we talk about sustainable architecture. It's not just technical solutions, it's not just energy and CO2, or about low carbon materials, all of that, but so much more as well. And so we actually then in our book use these 10 themes to cover that sort of holistic aspect, and energy and CO2 is one theme, materials is another, but then we have environment as a theme, performance, how buildings or spaces work in reality. It's no point we save carbon on paper only, that, we think we design for health and well-being, but it's only achieved on paper only, it has to happen in reality. So all of those components and, people and community infrastructure, they're all part then of sustainable architecture. So really, the link between climate change and sustainable architecture is profound. And what we need to do with our sustainable architecture is why I call it super architecture. It has to do a lot. And it's super important. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if that answered your question, but
it did. Thank you. And can you share some examples of sustainable architecture projects that you find particularly inspiring or impactful that we have at the moment?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, my students' projects, a lot of what my students do, and I'm sure it's the same with every other university, but, they inspire me every day. But of course, their design projects are not actually truly built yet, at least.
Mm-hmm.
But some projects that come to mind are, for example, the Principles of Sponge City by Terenscape in China, where they really restored the river floodplains in the cities instead of really containing them into the city. They're really restoring it back to natural floodplain, giving it space back to water, to nature, to other species, but then also leisure for humans as well, and really creating a new city lung as well. So it's amazing what they do with that. Along those lines, there's the Barcelona super blocks as well that bring safety and greenery back to the city. It deprioritizes motorized transport as well. So it's, again, these inclusive and just kind of transitions acting as social infrastructure. And I'm choosing these examples quite deliberate because actually they're about transforming and in many ways restoring our existing urban environment. And they are about these bigger principles that have been undertaken with the community in China. It's actually mostly with politicians. But that, it's really about working with the existing and preparing, restoring, transforming that. And we need a lot more of those kind of projects. We need to adapt what we have. That's such a priority. And then, of course, at building scale, we have like at DOAA, their work, particularly in social housing in France. There's incredibly interesting work being done and truly inspirational work being done in Denmark, particularly about material reuse and working with buildings that are material banks, both using reclaimed materials, but then also that in the future the materials can be reclaimed again, and that's Valkunsten architects and Lenager architects, and that's really looking at sort of these material banks as new frontiers. And then I think there's, of course, other projects that are really unique and experimental, like these other ones I just mentioned. But then I think interesting architects are Shigeru Ban, Hiroshi Sambyuki in Japan. Then we've got Francis Kramer, Burkina Faso, Samira Rathod in India. And then also, for example, Helen and Hard in Norway are doing very interesting work. Steven and Takala here in Finland, and particularly around sort of co-living and people and community aspects as well, alongside them using a lot of kind of new timber techniques too. But I'm choosing also, in a way, these projects quite deliberately that, not all of these follow this master architect principle. They're often collectively done. They're often quiet, sustainable architecture as well. You might not be familiar necessarily with some of these as well. But it's really why I think they're so interesting is they really focus not so much on who is the architect, but on how the architecture is created, on the processes of creating architecture. And so more the collective undertaking as architects rather than the one single master heading up the practices. And I think that that's really important to emphasize as part of sustainable architecture. And then particularly practices that are so interesting in that regard is non-conform architecture. Non-conform are in Austria, so they become a lot of the facilitator of processes. Architecture autogérée, Donna Petrescu's in Sheffield School of Architecture. Ram Labor in Berlin, Assemble Architects in the UK, just to name a few, that are really doing very interesting work around that and very collaborative with the community, very embedded in the community and using these democratic processes and working collectively. And particularly also, I think what's inspirational is that architecture doesn't always have to be building, it doesn't always have to be a physical construct. It can be about processes enabling communities to understand their needs, and then really work with the communities to create change as well. So those are the things that I think are really inspirational, or are happening kind of recently.
For these projects to be so successful and to have this impact on sustainability, what do you think are the biggest challenges for architects and designers face when creating sustainability buildings and infrastructures?
Well, for a very long time, if you think about it, that I dedicated the past 20 years to sustainable architecture. And for a very long time, I thought it was the lack of access to information, the lack of access to accessible information, especially, and particularly in architecture schools or also in architecture practice, that, it struck me that when I was also working in practice until 2009 in London, it struck me that I sort of had to look at huge books to find out about daylight or green roofs or timber. And that was one of the reasons why I wrote the Environmental Design Pocketbook, is still in these key kind of rules of thumb and key kind of pieces of knowledge into one single source. It's much easier to go through. So for a very long time, I thought it was lack of access to accessible information, lack of time of architects and find it and know, where to go, what to find, why we were not creating more sustainable buildings. But I've been reflecting on this a lot in the last few years, because I don't think we can really say that lack of access to information or accessible information is a problem these days at all. And I've come to understand that, what is making us not progress fast enough, not deep enough, is, particularly in the last 5 years, I've come to understand that, for the major part, it comes down to our values and our own attitudes and culture in our decision-making. So as architects, we're part of a system that we operate in that is prioritizing the burning of fossil fuels, the use of materials that we don't ask questions about where it comes from, whether it has damaged ecosystems halfway across the world, whether it pollutes local rivers, whether it affects health and well-being. We don't ask those questions, and we are part of that culture. And so I've realized that actually we cannot create sustainable architecture even if we have all of the information, because we have to make those decisions based with those underlying values. It comes back a little bit to the metaphor that I use to my students, is that we often think that we can, that the green transition just means like, okay, we replace all our fossil fuel cars with clean electric cars, right? First of all, depending where the electricity comes from, is clean locally or not at all. Like, if it's renewable energy, then it's clean. But if it's actually then electric cars, but it's still not clean energy and we're burning coal for it, it's actually not a clean car. But the whole point is it's not just this transition from petrol fuel cars to green cars. We need to fundamentally rethink how we get around our cities. We need much fewer cars. Why are we still designing car park buildings or car park spaces? Why are we not designing our cities completely different? Because as soon as you realize that, you realize the benefits of having a city that's based on other modes of transportation, walking, cycling, because basically it's much more inclusive, it's free. People are more healthy that way. We don't need all of these fuels, we don't pollute, we don't have noise pollution. So the green transition isn't just, yes, of course, the fewer cars we have should be clean cars, but actually the green transition is really about fundamentally redesigning our cities and how we move around them. And it's the same for buildings. It's not enough to just put some solar panels on and to have low energy, low carbon buildings, but it's about so much more. And as long as in architecture, we don't understand that truly, and we can have all the information we want, we are just sort of minimizing our impact, but we're not truly creating restorative designs. And so it's really about, if we have a system, an economic system, and if we're part of a culture that undermines sustainable decision-making because, hey, it's costly or it's not our priority, because our values are about our profit margin rather than the environment and the planet we live on, then actually we are not making the right decisions. And that's why we're so slow in actually creating a change in the built environment as well. So we're starting from the wrong starting point to then make the right decisions. So yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but I mean, ultimately, when we're in a neoliberal society that places profit above all else, above planetary well-being, above human well-being and other species well-being, it in a way encourages or even demands that we exploit resources and extract the planet for these short-term gains and for that maximization of profit. And ultimately, as architecture plugs into that, we're spatializing basically neoliberal kind of, principles and capitalocene. And those values that go with it. So it's from who we build for to how we build to what we build. And we don't involve users and community. And so that's why really the capitalocene it's climate emergency are entirely linked with each other. One leads to the other. And so the values we have must be much more, as architects, must be much more about serving the public, serving the planet, doing good for the planet, rather than actually serving the stakeholder, the shareholders of companies. And I think that's a massive shift in architecture that nobody's prepared for yet. It is really undertaking, only at the margins is being undertaken. So our biggest challenge in summary, I'm thinking out loud a little bit, but our biggest in summary is really about our own values and attitudes that are based on 20th century principles of the master architect, of the capitalocene, of extraction, exploitation. And we're living now in the 21st century in a climate emergency, and it has been a huge contributor to the problem, but it will definitely not how we can solve the problem. So we have to fix our values, and we have to, system change instead of climate change, basically. And that's uncomfortable for us as architects because it's everything we know is up in the air. But yeah.
Okay. And so you're probably aware as well, and every time I go to social media, there's any updates about artificial intelligence updates, etc., especially now this year. And so, can you speak to the role of technology in sustainable architecture and how emerging technologies might change the way we design and build sustainable structures?
Well, maybe that's a nice follow-on, isn't it, from my kind of reflections earlier about what are our challenges. So I don't think, again, information is being our biggest challenge. I don't think that the lack of solutions and technologies are a challenge. We pretty much can build a restorative, carbon neutral society that's inclusive and a just green society without new technologies. We have most what we need. Sure, we can have a bit more materials and, new technologies might help and so on. But actually, so what I would say with pretty much all the technology that we need to do what we need to have done to create this super architecture that I talk about, but we're not currently using what we have in the right way. So it's what we do with the technologies that matters so much. And at the moment, if we don't have these right underlying values, we're not able to make the right decisions, even of what technology is right, where, when, what are the downsides to it. And I would even say that a lot of these technologies are a distraction from real action, because if we believe that, new technology will just resolve and we wait for that, it means we meanwhile don't actually do what we need to do and don't use the technologies we already have, don't use the principles we already have. And technology is not going to save us. We just have to be very careful that we don't, in the meantime, if we think that, we do nothing and then we're in denial. And I think it's, again, this sort of 20th century values that technology might come along and save us. But we've already known what we need to do. We just haven't been doing it. And as a profession, we've been in denial for a very long time about this, unfortunately.
And so you mentioned as well about your students that are a bit of inspiration about the way they design sustainable, let's say. And so what advice would you give for your architects or designers interested in pursuing sustainable architecture as a career?
So what I tell my students, because climate anxiety is, of course, real, but what I tell my students when they are really sort of not sure what to do and they feel quite anxious about it all and they feel that they have no power to do anything, I think what's been very hopeful, inspiring and encouraging and also empowering for them is that, when every single project, if you think about this, every single project pollutes the earth, the rivers, that we swim in, that we get water from, the soil that we grow food on, that we build buildings on, the air we breathe, we pollute. But if you then think of it, every single project they create can be a positive influence, can do the opposite of that. It means that we have that influence as architects. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, that every action matters and that with our own values, we can decide to create that positive change. And we must do that because, climate change is real, the climate emergency is real. We have no time to waste. So I think that's, it's a really different way of thinking about what our role is as architects and responsibility we have as architects and serving the public and the planet first and foremost, above our own career or CV. Of course, we all want to work for a living wage or better, ideally, but it's ultimately actually working towards creating a better world and doing the best for the planetary health. And I think that's the attitude people should have towards a career. And I must say that I've never been short of work. If anything, I have too much work all the time, as you know, because it's taken so long to try to get a meeting with me to talk with you. So to talk to each other has been quite difficult. Yeah.
No, absolutely. It's interesting the comparison that you gave between the architect and the doctor. And it made me think it's actually really true in the way when we start to design a building or even the research part of it, of the early stages of the design. And until do we start first from the form or do we start first the materials we're going to use to the building? And so do you have a personal, let's say, process when it comes to design a building or the thinking of the design process? Do you start first from the sustainability part of it, or do you start to emerge more about the context of the site for the form of the building? I will say probably you are more specialized in sustainability. It might be a different thinking, But what would you say it could be a key point or key principle for someone just graduated from uni, for example, and it might be confused in the way of the strategy uh, of the design process, let's say. So what would you say in your experience those key points to go through a sustainable design?
Yes, I think I'm very much a contextual designer. So for me, the context is what is a starting point. But even conceptual designers can create sustainable architecture as long as then they test their concept in context. In the book, we use a 5-step design process, and which first starts with explore, which means background research. And that means desktop research, finding out everything about the place, the people there, the client's brief, the functions, everything you can know. And it also includes, of course, going to decide the experiences you get from it, which are more subjective. But, moments that you think, is there too much noise on the side, or actually there's amazing bird song, then you can utilize those things in your project. And that then brings you to step 2, which is defining the project. And that second step, the first 2 steps, I would actually say, are the most important in the design process. So there's 5 of them: explore, define, imagine, test, and then feedback, which that's really like peer feedback or kind of, discussing with each other and iterative kind of working. But I would say that the first 2 are the grounding of any project. And if you don't get it right at the beginning, it's very difficult to then add sustainability in later. And then the defining comes out of that exploration phase, that research, that deep research that you've been doing. But then also, of course, your own values, of this project will not do any damage to the site. It will only restore. And, you've already explored in your first stage, what are the damages to the site in the past? What are the things that need restoring? And that's really what defines a new project. And from then, you can then start to imagine solutions or interventions or transformations or work that you don't do anything to the site. And then the testing involves, for example, through drawing, model making, digital models, maybe even making something going back to the site. That means I'm really testing your project into the context, testing whether it meets your own vision, your own project definition, your own values for the project as well. And we just don't do that often enough. We don't often do the exploration phase and the definition phase long enough or at all. And that's something actually that UEL, at least when I was a student, taught there was very, very good at the background research. And I think that's super important, that it's evidence-based, it's based on knowledge, it's based on all the information you have. And of course, it also includes working with, if you can, with the local community, finding out about the local stakeholders and so on. Even in student projects, you can do that. And so the whole Designing for the Climate Emergency book, one of the key ideas and unique things about it is that we don't just throw information as students, but we try to map it very much according to those 5 steps. If you're at the start of your project, what are the things you should consider now that are important to collect information from your site? And then how can it help you define your project? What are your values? How do you set your values of your project? And so we go step by step through these aspects to help the designer to incorporate sustainability. Actually, it's even the wrong phrasing to really have it as a starting point to sustainability at the core, at the heart of the project, really center it at the heart of the project and not at the end, oh yes, sustainability, I'll have some solar panels and I'm using wood, but actually wood might not be the right choice depending on what you've done in the research and so on and what's available locally. So yeah.
No, very interesting.
I don't know if that answered your question, but
it does. No, thank you. And so a part of your book, the design mostly for architect students, but obviously it can be abroad for any other person or professional interested on the topic. Do you believe that architecture education, it should be shaped a little bit better for sustainability part of it, in the way our architectural education not teaching enough sustainability, for example? What's your opinion on this?
Not doing enough. It's not doing it fast enough. It's not doing it early enough. And it's not also teaching it in the right way. One of the things that, and I also didn't do it in the right way for a very, very long time, because, there are several problems, right, in architecture education. It's the most amazing course you can study, I think. But one of the problems with it is that we rely so much on architects in practice, like myself. That's how I started out as a teacher. I was in practice, and as an ex-student, I was asked to come back and teach. But I had no training whatsoever to teach. Like, I had no pedagogical underpinning, because it was sort of the idea you were a good student, you were doing interesting work in practice, so we want to have that benefit to teach. And that's really important, of course, that we get people that are in practice, that they are teaching. But at the same time, depends what they do and so on. They might only have very specific sustainability knowledge. It could be on materials, it could be on participatory processes, but they don't have this holistic knowledge necessarily. Equally, if you only have a researcher, then they again don't tend to have holistic knowledge of it. And most of us don't have training to teach it. And in the last 20 years, I've taken several courses, I've tested several things on my students, and then you realize there's a whole body of work of good teaching practices, and architecture doesn't necessarily use many of them. It depends from individual to individual. But so we need to teach more content, but also it's not enough that it's just a lecture. This passive learning is not how we remember. And it's very interesting. On our Arc for Change project, we did a survey across 5 different European institutions, and we asked the teachers and the students, do you get taught these things? Certainly, there was a whole range of topics, like really, like there was 25 different topics. And students would say, no, not really, we don't get taught that. Teachers, yeah, I teach it. And that shows you the difference, that it's just a lecture, or it's in a discussion, it might get briefly mentioned, or we don't say that this is about sustainability. So students, we can't expect students to remember. None of us learn passively very well. So we need actually more active learning methods, which means that it's more discussion-based, it's democratic processes, it's group-based. It's also based around this deeper learning, that, people might watch or read something in advance, and then you come to class and discuss it in a group together. So there's that deeper learning and that more internalizing of the knowledge, and that's really, really hard thing to do, because most of the time it's very kind of a lecture. And then we have the guidances, the tutorials and then the crits as well. But actually, those are not the moments that most learning actually happens. It's more in these democratic processes, peer-to-peer, where we have very specific teaching activities that students learn about how to apply sustainability in their own project. If I come and give a lecture about solar panels, then you go, okay, I know about solar panels, but there's a different thing learning to apply it in your own project. And so a lot of my teaching is very workshop-based. It's actually students having a go at doing it in their master's thesis or in their actual design project, or then learning it on literally calculating things by hand and trying to integrate more of that knowledge. And then, of course, we have to teach it from day one. If in year one of the big issues I have at the moment with architecture education, including my own institution as well, is that traditionally, students arrive and they start learning to build a small new building from the beginning, when actually from the very beginning in year one, students should just learn what is the organisms on the side, who are the people we design for, how do we impact this plot that we build on, what's the kind of planetary well-being connection to that. And we just don't do that. That comes in then usually at master's level, when we have to unbrainwash again. As soon as you go, I wish if I'd known that earlier. I may not have done the designs in my studies before, but also it's very late. So we have to change the culture at that moment. So we have to teach more of the fundamental sustainability aspects much, much earlier. And I don't think it's energy and carbon, it's more the values, the value basis of what is architecture for, what does it mean creating a better and more sustainable tomorrow? How do we do that? What is the role of the architect going forward? More like a medic rather than a builder, How do we minimize impact? Those big questions actually have to come in year one, yet we typically only trust students with it in year 4 and year 5. And I think it's too late, because those is where we set the values and where students internalize these values when they go into the projects. And then it's basically we need to get students to ask the right questions to begin with at a very early stage, rather than in the 4th or 5th year.
No, absolutely. Thank you. And so we touched about the book as well. And what were the challenges you and the other authors of the book found during the writing process?
Time.
If you were any.
Yeah, no, there was definitely several challenges. One, we wrote it throughout COVID. So we never once met online. So yes, and I also would never have done it on my own. So I deliberately asked others to come in to help author it. And I was so lucky with my co-authors, everybody bringing their expertise, being able to brainstorm. But we didn't do that throughout COVID period, when all of us had very different kind of lockdown situations and emergencies to deal with. So that was slightly surreal. But then I think also time, right? We knew that the book was so needed and we couldn't work faster because we're doing this in our spare time. Most of us, ultimately, most of it was done in our evenings, weekends, holidays, because we just had other teaching that had to roll over, research projects as well. Of course, some of the time we had some working hours for it, but on the whole, it's such a gigantic job to do. The other thing also was that we didn't diversity, right? We knew that this book, we are all Europeans, and we come from a very European, Northern European perspective. So we also wanted to sort of open it up a little bit, which is then also more difficult to do because it's not necessarily natural to us or the natural kind of knowledge. So it was then also about the language, but then also diversity of case studies. So in the end, we had a rule whereby we said that we have 200 case studies that we just mentioned. We don't have pictures of them, but we just mentioned the case studies to look at for each of the 10 themes. We have them. And we just had a rule whereby only 50% could be of the typical suspects. The rest would have to be from non-European architects or not placed in Europe. And also not be by white men, basically. So we set rules like that. And sometimes it was really difficult because, we have language barriers that we don't necessarily find out about projects. It's also very uncomfortable talking about or recommending projects that you haven't visited, that you have to Google Translate information of. And whether we then do justice to some of it is very hard. So that was really important for us, that we had a diversity of projects represented. And then, of course, we also have some diversity through our student projects as well, that were then from all over the world, even though only in 4 universities. But then at least our students are from all over the world, that we had that represented. And then the other challenge we also had was originally this was going to be a part 1 book, and then it would be a part 2 and part 3, playing on part 1, part 2, part 3. But we then really struggled to separate out the knowledge required for for bachelor's, for master's, and then if you're in practice, because then it all depends on what your level is, what you've studied, where you studied. And so the book ended up being twice as big because of that, and then focusing mostly on kind of the knowledge you kind of need for all architecture studies, and then you can choose in how much depth you go depending on what you already know. So you can kind of go broader. So those were, I think, our biggest challenges. We were very, very lucky that I had some funding from my university to hire ex-students, actually at the time students, to help with production of images. So we actually had, who's now on my research team as well, on the teaching team, but they ended up drawing over 100 images from scratch to illustrate key principles. So that wasn't a challenge in the end, but we were very lucky because it could have well been a challenge for us as authors as well. So that was a 2-year project. But so far the feedback's really good, and I'm using it also in teaching, but I always welcome anybody listening or yourself. Nothing's perfect, so we're always open for feedback and room to improve it going forward as well. And it's also available as an ebook, which is kind of cool as well. But yeah.
Oh, thank you. No, definitely, because as I mentioned before, I do have the book for myself, and I really find it interesting the way it was written and as well illustrated. And if funny enough, I liked it the way it was presented, and I also use the same color palette for my diagrams or presentations. But thank you for that. And so this for the last question. It might be hard to answer depending, but so in your opinion, are the policymakers and government officials doing enough to promote sustainability to help fight climate change? And the reason why I'm asking this is I like it to compare with COVID in the way of most of the times when we see people say, oh, you should recycle a home or etc.,
people just seems to don't care because they are not forced to do. They just, okay, it's a problem for someone else to do it, to recycle or etc. And so what I found with with COVID especially was when government was saying you need to stay home to be safe, in the way of you need to recycle to save the planet in the same way. So I feel like the government is not really forcing people or not doing much of obligation to recycle or to be more sustainable. So I don't know. Again, I'm not sure in terms of the politicians how it works in this case, but it's just in the way I could see, or in terms of my opinion.
I fully agree with you. And I actually use COVID myself as an example that politicians and basically politicians get lobbied a lot by the housing sector, by the construction industry. So we're not ready. It's too soon, these changes. So that's why we have these step changes to the building regulations, so people can prepare industry to be ready, which is skills, but new production processes and so on. But ultimately, look exactly what happened with COVID. The government could very fast say, actually, for community well-being now, you need to do this and that you must do this. So it shows you how that a government can act if they want to. I'm quite controversial about these things, that I'm also an academic, so I can speak quite freely, and I must speak freely as well in that sense. But there is absolutely not enough at all from any government in the world. Nobody's doing enough. And the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, have been also very vocal about this. What they've been saying is that each country's had to submit these plans, right? In the 2015 COP, can't remember now, was it COP21? COP20, in 2015, we had the COP meeting, and it was then agreed that each country would submit this sort of plan of how they would actually reduce carbon emissions and create this green transition. And even if every country does exactly what they set out in the plans, that is not enough to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius in the world. And that's the other thing the IPCC said, we're not even doing what we promised we would do in those plans, including the UK and Finland and so on. So we know that we're not doing enough. We know we need to do more. We need to do more faster as well. And it's just politically not popular. And I think in a way, nobody's been brave enough. But history will not look kindly on those politicians that haven't done enough. And ultimately, I also think that the public are being lied to as well. So I think a lot of people are in denial. But I also think those people that know what needs to happen are not telling the truth. Look, this is terrible, how we have to do it. It's not being communicated very well. The public is being lied to. Nobody wants to make unpopular decisions because politicians want to be re-elected. So they only think of 4-year time frame or 5 years. They don't think of, by 2030, we're in trouble. Or by 2050, that's a long time away, not our problem, right? As if they live quite literally on a different planet as well. And of course, I also think that there is a political elite, or the politicians are often an elite, and they somehow think that it doesn't apply to them and they'll be rich enough to buy their way out the worst crisis that are going to hit them when it comes our way. But I think COVID is a very good example to show how that actually we can do things top down. It's just how do we do that, and how do we, by ideally what we do, we create democratic processes and we bring the people with us so everybody understands why we need to wear a mask, so we don't get demonstrations on the street about this, and we get good adherence to this. So that's ideally what we do, but we don't have, even in democratic processes, democratic systems for this. I mean, there are, and there are more and more, but like in Ireland and Belgium, there is like this sort of citizen assembly, whereby people then can vote in for, and they're very informed citizens, can then vote, not quite like referenda, because look at what happened with Brexit, but so basically we don't really have many democratic processes that bring people in to buy into big changes. And I'm very happy to say we need much more legislation, and we need it top down, but then at the same time also involving people in these adaptation and transformation plans as well, which is exactly what the IPCC is advocating we should be doing around the world, because we're not doing it. But that also means, from my perspective, as architects, we also can no longer sit back and go, well, it's not my fault because government isn't having this as a minimum legislation, and that we then still keep designing to the to building regulations when that's the worst we can legally get away with. That doesn't mean it's good. That we actually have to be more ambitious. And that's also why I'm talking about values and system change, that ultimately, if it doesn't come from the top down, then we're going to have to do it from the bottom up, because we live on the same planet and nobody's going to care about architecture and beauty and the beautiful spaces we create when we're in a 4 degrees Celsius world. Nobody is going to care. Architecture will not matter at that point. So yeah, we have to be part of that change and of that bottom-up change as well.
Wow, thank you very much. That honestly was a really interesting and engaged conversation, and I'm especially myself, I learned so much just for 45-50 minutes on this podcast, and I hope the listeners also enjoyed what we just talked, the diverse of topics on the part of sustainability, on how much we still need to do, let's say. No, Sofie, thank you very much. That was very interesting and very engaged about sustainability, and to hear about us as well from your expertise. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for giving me the space to sort of reflect, because we don't often do that enough either, and I hope I was making sense in communication and not rambling too much. So, wrapped up in my own reflection. Yeah, feedback's always welcome.